I never thought a stack of firewood would become the catalyst for the most absurd neighborhood war I'd ever witnessed, but there I was, standing in front of my lake cabin, watching Margaret Johnson load up her SUV with my carefully split oak logs for the third time that week. My name is Lawrence Baker, and I'd owned this cabin at Pine Ridge Lake in northern Minnesota for about 8 years. The property sat on the edge of a sprawling HOA community that had been developed back in the 90s, complete with strict rules about everything from dock placement to mailbox colors. Most of the time, I could ignore the bureaucratic nonsense because I only came up on weekends during the summer and occasionally in the fall. The place was my sanctuary, a 2-bedroom A-frame with a wraparound deck that overlooked the water, surrounded by white pines and birch trees. The HOA here wasn't like your typical suburban nightmare. It was specifically designed for lakefront properties, about 40 cabins total, each spaced far enough apart that you could pretend you were alone in the woods if you wanted to. The monthly fees were reasonable, covering road maintenance, the boat launch, and a communal beach area. For years, everything ran smoothly under a rotating board of retirees who mostly left everyone alone. Then, Margaret Johnson got elected as HOA president last spring. Margaret was 52, recently divorced, and had apparently decided that micromanaging her neighbors would fill the void in her life. She had that classic Karen haircut, the asymmetrical bob with blonde highlights that screamed, "I want to speak to your manager." She drove a white Lexus SUV and wore yoga pants with designer sneakers, even though I'd never seen her do anything more athletic than aggressively point at people during HOA meetings. The Firewood situation started in early September. I'd spent an entire Saturday in August cutting and splitting 2 cords of oak and birch that I'd had delivered. Stacking firewood is meditative for me, the kind of physical work that clears my head after a week of staring at spreadsheets in my Minneapolis office. I worked in financial analysis for a medical device company, which meant my brain was usually fried by Friday afternoon. The cabin was my reset button. I'd built a proper firewood shed the previous year, a simple 3-sided structure with a slanted roof to keep the rain and snow off. It sat about 20 feet from my cabin, clearly on my property, well within the surveyed boundaries. The wood was for my personal use during the cooler months. There's nothing quite like a fire in the wood stove on a crisp October evening while watching the sunset over the lake. The first time I noticed wood missing, I figured maybe I'd miscounted. The second time, 2 weeks later, I knew something was up. I'd had the place to myself the previous weekend and hadn't burned anything. Yet when I arrived the following Friday evening, at least a dozen logs were gone. I mentioned it to my neighbor Bill, an older guy who lived in the cabin to my south year-round, since he'd retired from teaching. Bill was in his 70s, had a white beard that made him look like a Minnesota Santa Claus, and knew everything that happened in the community. "Oh yeah," he said, leaning against his porch railing. "Margaret's been helping herself to wood from a few people. She claims that since the HOA maintains the roads and common areas, any wood stored on properties is considered a shared resource during the winter months." I stared at him. That's completely insane. I bought and split that wood myself. It's on my property. Bill shrugged. I tried telling her that. She cited some clause in the HOA bylaws about community resource sharing during emergency situations. Said with the cost of heating oil going up, firewood constitutes an emergency resource. There's no emergency, and that's not how property ownership works. Preaching to the choir, Lawrence, but she's got Jerry and Pat backing her up on the board, and they vote as a block on everything. Jerry Morrison and Pat Sullivan were Margaret's cronies, 2 other board members who seemed to have nothing better to do than enforce increasingly ridiculous interpretations of the HOA rules. Jerry was a retired insurance adjuster who treated every interaction like a claims investigation, and Pat was a former office manager who apparently missed having people to boss around. I decided to handle it directly. That Saturday morning, I drove over to Margaret's cabin, which was one of the larger properties on the North Shore. She was outside, arranging pumpkins on her steps in some elaborate fall display. "Margaret, we need to talk about my firewood," I said, keeping my tone civil. She looked up, and I could already see the defensive posture settling into her shoulders. "What about it?" "You've been taking it. I need you to stop." "I haven't been taking anything, Lawrence. I've been redistributing community resources according to HOA guidelines." There are no HOA guidelines that give you permission to take firewood I purchased and split myself from my private property. She stood up, brushing dirt off her hands. Actually, if you'd attended the last board meeting instead of skipping it like you usually do, you'd know we voted on Resolution 47B, which establishes a community resource pool for winter heating materials. You can't just vote to take people's property. It's not taking if it's properly authorized community sharing. Several residents don't have adequate heating supplies, and those of us with excess have a responsibility to contribute. I felt my jaw clench. I don't have excess. I have exactly what I need for my own use. You're only here on weekends, Lawrence. That's not full-time occupancy. The formula accounts for actual usage patterns. The formula? You created a formula for stealing people's firewood? Her eyes narrowed. I don't appreciate your tone. This is exactly the kind of selfish attitude that makes community governance difficult. If you have a complaint, you can submit it in writing to the board and we'll address it at next month's meeting. I'm addressing it right now. Stop taking my wood. Or what? She crossed her arms, and there it was, that classic Karen challenge daring me to escalate. I took a breath. Or I'll take legal action for theft. She actually laughed. Good luck with that. You agreed to abide by HOA decisions when you purchased your property. It's in your deed restrictions. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have things to do. I left before I said something I'd regret. Back at my cabin, I did what I should have done first and pulled out my copy of the HOA bylaws and deed restrictions. I spent 2 hours going through every page. There was absolutely nothing about community resource sharing, emergency provisions for firewood, or any authority for the board to confiscate personal property. Resolution 47B, I discovered when I checked the HOA website, had been passed at a meeting with only 8 residents present out of 40 property owners. The meeting minutes were buried in a subfolder and described the resolution in vague terms about optimizing community resources during seasonal transitions. The actual text of the resolution was even worse, full of circular bureaucratic language that basically said the board could determine what constituted excess resources and redistribute them as needed. I called my buddy Derek, who was a real estate attorney in Minneapolis. After I explained the situation, he laughed for a solid minute. Let me get this straight, he said. Your HOA president is just walking onto your property and taking your firewood? Apparently, it's official HOA policy now. That's theft. The resolution is meaningless. She can't vote herself permission to take your stuff. So what do? Document everything. Photos, dates, amounts. Send her a cease and desist letter. If she continues, you can pursue it as theft or file a civil suit. Honestly, though, for the amount we're talking about, it might cost you more in legal fees than the wood is worth. That was the problem. The wood itself was maybe worth $300. Attorney fees would run into the thousands. Margaret was banking on exactly that calculation. Over the next 2 weeks, I tried the official channels. I submitted a formal complaint to the board. I attended the next HOA meeting, where Margaret dismissed my concerns, and Jerry and Pat backed her up with straight faces. I sent a certified letter demanding she return my wood and cease entering my property. She responded with an official HOA notice citing me for having an improperly permitted firewood storage structure and threatening daily fines if I didn't submit architectural review paperwork for my woodshed, which had been standing for over a year without any previous issues. Meanwhile, she kept taking my wood. I'd arrive on Friday evening and find more missing. Once, I came up on a Wednesday and actually caught her in the act. She had the nerve to wave at me cheerfully while loading logs into her Lexus. "Just taking my allotment," she called out. "You don't have an allotment. That's my property. According to the resource allocation schedule, I'm entitled to 15 logs per week from properties with surplus. I don't have a surplus." She'd already closed her tailgate and was climbing into her driver's seat. "Your concern is noted. Have a great day, Lawrence." I stood there, absolutely fuming, as she drove away with my wood. That night, sitting on my deck with a beer, watching the stars come out over the lake, I decided I was done playing nice. Margaret wanted to interpret rules creatively. 2 could play that game. The wasp idea came to me the next morning. I was walking the property line when I noticed an old paper wasp nest attached to the eave of my shed. The wasps were long gone, it being late September, but seeing that abandoned nest triggered a memory from my childhood. My uncle had a farm in southern Minnesota, and one summer when I was maybe 12, he'd had a problem with someone stealing equipment from his barn. He told me a story about a farmer he knew who dealt with persistent thieves by leaving out bait they couldn't resist, then making that bait extremely unpleasant to steal. The specific method had involved red paint in a toolbox, but the principle stuck with me. I started researching. Wasps, I learned, could stay active well into October if the weather stayed warm, which it had been. Paper wasps, yellow jackets, and hornets were all still viable this time of year. More importantly, I learned about relocating wasp nests and creating artificial nest sites. The plan formed over the next few days. It was devious, possibly dangerous, and absolutely perfect. I drove back to Minneapolis on Sunday evening and spent Monday and Tuesday gathering supplies. I bought several artificial log sections from a craft store, the hollow kind used for Halloween decorations. I purchased protective beekeeping gear, including a full suit, gloves, and a smoker. Then, I drove out to a rural area in Anoka County where I'd located several active yellow jacket nests in the ground near an abandoned property. Yellow jackets are aggressive bastards, way more so than regular paper wasps. They can sting multiple times, they attack in swarms when threatened, and they're active during the day. Perfect. The extraction process was terrifying even with the protective gear. I went at dusk when they were less active, used the smoker to calm them, and carefully transferred chunks of the nest material containing larvae and workers into secure containers. I worked with 3 different nests to get enough wasps. By the time I was done, I had 5 containers, each filled with very angry yellow jackets. Back at my workshop in Minneapolis, I modified the hollow logs. I drilled entrance holes, installed mesh screens to keep the wasps in temporarily, and created conditions that would encourage the wasps to establish temporary residence. The beauty of the plan was that yellow jackets are opportunistic. They'd occupy the hollow logs as makeshift nests if given the right conditions. Over the next week, I cultivated my wasp logs. I fed them sugar water through the mesh screens. I kept them in my garage at the right temperature, and I watched as they settled in, building comb inside the hollow logs, treating their new homes as satellite nests. The following Friday, October 12th, I loaded my truck with the wasp logs, now housing 5 thriving yellow jacket colonies. The logs looked completely normal from the outside, just like any other split firewood, except for small entrance holes that wouldn't be noticed unless you were looking for them. I arrived at the cabin just after dark. The temperature was still in the high 50s, perfect wasp weather. Using thick gloves and moving carefully, I transferred the wasp logs into my firewood shed, positioning them strategically throughout the stack so they'd be among the first logs someone would grab. Then, I removed the mesh screens that had been keeping the wasps contained. Now they could come and go freely through the entrance holes. To anyone casually grabbing firewood, the logs would look completely normal until they were moved or disturbed. I set up a wildlife camera in a tree overlooking the woodshed, angled to capture anyone approaching. I wanted documentation of what would happen next. Saturday morning, I made sure to be visible around my property, doing normal cabin things, making it clear I was in residence. I figured Margaret wouldn't make a run at my wood while I was obviously home. I was right. She waited until Sunday afternoon, about an hour before I usually headed back to Minneapolis. I was inside, packing up my things, when I heard the scream. It was a shriek of pure terror, the kind of sound that makes your blood run cold even when you're expecting it. I ran outside to see Margaret stumbling backward from my woodshed, swatting frantically at the air around her head. Yellow jackets swarmed around her in an angry cloud. She'd clearly grabbed one of the wasp logs and disturbed the nest, and now they were defending their territory with extreme prejudice. "Get them off me! Get them off!" she screamed, running toward her Lexus. I stood on my porch watching. I should have felt bad. I almost felt bad. But then I remembered her smug face every time she'd stolen my wood, her condescending explanations about community resources, and I stayed right where I was. Margaret made it to her SUV, throwing herself inside and slamming the door. Several wasps had followed her in. Through her windshield, I could see her thrashing around, still swatting frantically. She finally got the vehicle started and peeled out of my driveway, her Lexus fishtailing on the gravel road. I walked over to the woodshed. Yellow jackets were still buzzing around, agitated from the disturbance. The log she'd grabbed was on the ground a few feet away, and I could see the entrance hole, now with wasps streaming in and out. Using my beekeeping suit, which I'd kept handy, I carefully secured the disturbed nest and relocated it to the woods behind my property. I checked the other wasp logs. They were intact, undisturbed, still waiting. I reviewed the footage from the wildlife camera that evening. It was perfect. Crystal clear video of Margaret approaching my woodshed, reaching for logs, grabbing the wasp-filled one, and then the chaos that followed. Her face, as she realized what was happening, was almost cartoonish in its horror. I didn't hear anything from her that night, which surprised me a bit. I'd half expected police or fire department or something. I headed back to Minneapolis Sunday evening as usual, curious about what the following week would bring. Tuesday morning, I got an email from the HOA with the subject line, "Urgent Safety Violation." "Dear Mr. Baker," it read, "it has come to the board's attention that you have created a dangerous condition on your property by harboring aggressive wasp nests in your firewood storage. This constitutes a safety hazard to the community and violates HOA rules regarding pest control and property maintenance. You are hereby required to remove all wasp nests immediately and provide proof of professional pest control treatment within 72 hours or face daily fines of $100. Additionally, the board is considering emergency sanctions including suspension of your property privileges. Margaret Johnson, HOA President." I replied, "Dear Margaret, thank you for bringing this to my attention. I was unaware there were wasps in my firewood as I've been burning wood from a different section of my pile. As the wasps are on my private property and I have not been using that portion of the woodshed, they pose no danger to me. If you encountered these wasps, I'm curious about what you are doing in my firewood shed. As for removal, I'll address it on my own timeline, as they're on my property and will die off naturally with the first hard freeze in a few weeks. Best regards, Lawrence Baker." Her response came within an hour. "Your negligent attitude toward community safety is noted. The board will be pursuing formal sanctions. You are also being cited for unauthorized wildlife habitat installation. This matter will be addressed at next week's emergency board meeting." The emergency board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at the community center, a small building near the boat launch. I made sure to attend. 17 residents showed up, a much better turnout than usual. Word had apparently spread that there was drama, and people loved drama. Margaret sat at the head table with Jerry and Pat flanking her. She had visible welts on her neck and arms from the wasp stings. I felt a small twinge of guilt, but then she started talking, and it evaporated. "We're here tonight to address a serious safety issue created by Lawrence Baker's negligence," she began. "Mr. Baker has been maintaining wasp nests on his property, creating a hazard that resulted in my being attacked and stung multiple times this past Sunday." "I haven't been maintaining anything," I said from my seat. "Wasps build nests. That's what they do. I didn't invite them." "You have a responsibility to control pests on your property," Jerry chimed in. "They're in my woodshed, on my property, not bothering anyone who doesn't go into my woodshed." "They're a community hazard," Margaret insisted. "How did you encounter them exactly?" I asked innocently. "Since they're in my woodshed, on my property?" There was a pause. Several other residents were now looking at Margaret with interest. "I was performing a community resource inventory," she said. "You were taking my firewood again, you mean?" "I was assessing community resources as authorized by Resolution 47B. An older woman I recognized but didn't know well raised her hand. "I have a question about that. This resolution about community resources. I wasn't at that meeting. Can someone explain what it actually means?" Margaret launched into her explanation about resource sharing and optimization and community responsibility. I could see people's expressions changing as they realized what she was describing. Bill, my neighbor, spoke up. "Let me get this straight. You've been going onto people's properties and taking their firewood?" "Redistributing," Margaret corrected. "From private property?" someone else asked, "according to the needs-based allocation formula." The meeting devolved from there. It turned out Margaret had been taking wood from at least 6 different properties. Most people hadn't said anything because, like me, they'd figured the cost of fighting wasn't worth it. But now, with everyone in the same room, the collective anger became impossible to ignore. A woman named Susan, who owned a cabin on the west shore, stood up. "You took 3/4 of my woodpile in August. I had to buy more because I didn't have enough for the winter. The allocation formula determined you had surplus based on your occupancy patterns," Margaret said, but her voice was less confident now. "That's theft," Susan said flatly. "You stole my property." "This is absurd," I added. "There's no legal basis for any of this. You can't vote yourself permission to take people's property. That's not how HOA authority works." Pat tried to defend Margaret. "The board has broad authority to act in the community's best interests." "Show me where in the bylaws it says you can confiscate personal property," I challenged. They couldn't because it didn't exist. The meeting lasted another hour and got increasingly heated. By the end, a group of residents had called for a special election to remove Margaret, Jerry, and Pat from the board. The vote would happen in 2 weeks. Margaret tried to regain control. "This is clearly a coordinated attack on the board's authority. Lawrence Baker has created a dangerous situation out of spite, and rather than holding him accountable, you're all siding with him." "You were stealing from him," Bill said. "From all of us. The Wasps are just karma." "I could have been killed. Those were aggressive Yellow Jackets." "On his property," Susan pointed out, "where you were trespassing." Margaret's face was red now, her composure cracking. "Fine. You want to remove the board? Go ahead. See how well this community functions without proper leadership. And Lawrence, you can expect legal action for the injuries I sustained." "Good luck with that," I said. "I've got video of you trespassing and taking my property. You want to involve lawyers? Let's involve lawyers." That shut her up. The meeting ended shortly after, with Margaret storming out, Jerry and Pat trailing behind her like confused puppies. Over the next 2 weeks, things escalated in ways I hadn't anticipated. Margaret, apparently, didn't take rejection well. First, I got a citation for my woodshed being an unpermitted structure. Then, I got cited for having a dock that extended 6 inches beyond the allowed waterfront projection. Then, I got cited for having vegetation on my property that exceeded the height limits. Then, I got cited for my cabin's exterior paint being a non-approved color, even though it had been the same color for 8 years. She was throwing everything she could at me, trying to bury me in violations and fines. I responded by filing a formal complaint with the county about HOA harassment and theft. I submitted my documentation, including the video of Margaret taking my wood, the HOA meeting minutes showing the suspicious Resolution 47B, and records of all the bogus citations she'd issued. Other residents did the same. It turned out Margaret had been using her position to harass people for months, targeting anyone who questioned her authority. The special election happened on October 27th. 32 of the 40 property owners voted, a record turnout. Margaret, Jerry, and Pat were removed from the board unanimously. A new board was elected, including Bill and Susan, and their first act was to rescind Resolution 47B and any other emergency policies Margaret had implemented. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. On November 3rd, I drove up to the cabin for what I figured would be a peaceful weekend. The trees were mostly bare now, the lake was cold and gray, and the first snow was forecast for the following week. I'd planned to winterize the cabin and close it up until spring. I arrived Friday evening just before dark and immediately noticed something wrong. My front door was open. I grabbed a flashlight from my truck and approached carefully. The door wasn't just open, it was kicked in, the frame splintered around the lock. Inside was chaos. Furniture was overturned, cushions slashed, dishes smashed. Someone had torn through my cabin like a tornado. My TV was shattered, my laptop was gone, and all my fishing gear had been thrown around the room. But the worst part was the firewood. Someone had taken every single log from my woodshed and thrown them through my windows. The cabin was filled with broken glass and scattered wood. Some of the logs had clearly been the wasp logs, now destroyed, their empty chambers exposed. Written on my living room wall in spray paint were the words, "Resource sharing." I called 911. The sheriff's department in Clearwater County, where Pine Ridge Lake was located, sent a deputy within 45 minutes. Deputy Tom Richardson was in his 30s, professional, and took the whole thing seriously. "You have any idea who might have done this?" he asked, photographing the damage. "Yeah, I've got a pretty good idea." I explained the whole situation, from the firewood theft to the HOA drama to Margaret's removal from the board. "You're talking about Margaret Johnson? You know her?" He sighed. "We've had interactions. She's called us out to the lake community probably a dozen times in the past 6 months for various complaints. Noise violations, trespassing accusations, suspicious vehicles, most of it nonsense." "Well, this isn't nonsense. This is breaking and entering, vandalism, and destruction of property." "You got evidence connecting her to this?" I showed him my wildlife camera footage. The camera was motion activated and had been recording since I'd installed it. I scrolled through to that afternoon and found what I was looking for. At 2:47 p.m., a white Lexus SUV pulled up to my cabin. Margaret got out, along with Jerry and Pat. Clear as day, the three of them approached my cabin. Jerry carried a sledgehammer. Margaret had a can of spray paint. The video showed Jerry breaking down my door. It showed all three of them going inside. It showed them coming out, going to my woodshed, and systematically throwing every log through my windows. It showed Margaret spray painting the message on my wall while Jerry and Pat smashed my belongings. The video was date and time stamped, high definition, and absolutely damning. Deputy Richardson watched the footage twice. "Well, that makes my job easier. I'm going to need a copy of this." I transferred the file to a USB drive I had in my truck. "Wait here," the deputy said. He went to his patrol car and got on the radio. 20 minutes later, 2 more deputies arrived. Richardson explained the situation, showed them the video, and they headed out. I stayed at Bill's cabin that night, since mine was uninhabitable. Bill made coffee and listened as I recounted the whole insane story from beginning to end. "I knew Margaret was unhinged," he said, "but I didn't think she'd go this far. She just destroyed probably $15,000 worth of property, not counting the cleanup and repairs. At least you've got video. They'll nail her for this." Around 10 p.m., Deputy Richardson called me. "We've made arrests. Margaret Johnson, Jerry Morrison, and Pat Sullivan are all in custody. They'll be arraigned Monday morning. You'll need to come to the courthouse to file a formal complaint and victim impact statement." "Did they confess?" "Not exactly. Ms. Johnson claimed they were performing an emergency safety inspection based on your firewood violations. Said the damage was necessary to remove a hazardous condition. Mr. Morrison and Ms. Sullivan backed her up, but the story doesn't hold water given the video evidence and the spray-painted message. An emergency safety inspection with a sledgehammer and spray paint. Yeah. The county attorney is not buying it. You're looking at burglary, criminal damage to property, conspiracy, and possibly hate crime enhancements given the targeted nature. Hate crime seemed like a stretch, but I wasn't going to argue. The weekend was a blur of documentation. I photographed every inch of damage. I compiled receipts for everything that was destroyed. I called my insurance company and filed a claim. The adjuster came out Monday morning and estimated the total damage at just over $18,000. The arraignment was Monday afternoon at the Clearwater County Courthouse in Bagley, Minnesota. I drove the hour and a half from the lake to attend. Margaret, Jerry, and Pat were brought in wearing orange jumpsuits, looking significantly less confident than they had at any HOA meeting. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Judith Hendricks, was clearly not impressed. The county attorney, a young guy named Marcus Webb, laid out the charges: first-degree burglary, felony criminal damage to property, conspiracy to commit burglary, and trespassing. The video evidence was presented, and even Margaret's attorney, a tired-looking public defender, didn't try to argue the facts. Bail was set at $50,000 each. Margaret's family posted hers within hours. Jerry and Pat weren't as lucky and stayed in custody. Over the next month, the legal process ground forward. I gave depositions, provided documentation, and worked with both my insurance company and the county attorney's office. The insurance payout came through, covering most of the repairs, though I was still out my deductible and the time spent fixing everything. I hired a contractor to repair the cabin. The windows were replaced, the door frame rebuilt, the interior repainted and refurnished. I decided to upgrade the security while I was at it, installing proper cameras, motion sensor lights, and a monitored alarm system. The new HOA board was horrified by the whole situation and extremely apologetic. They voted to reimburse me for my deductible and the security system installation, pulling from the HOA reserve fund. They also passed new bylaws explicitly prohibiting board members from entering private properties without written permission and establishing proper oversight for any future policy changes. Margaret, Jerry, and Pat were officially banned from holding any HOA positions and hit with trespassing notices for all HOA properties, meaning they effectively couldn't participate in any community activities. The criminal case went to trial in January. I testified about the months of harassment, the firewood theft, the escalating citations, and finally, the break-in. The video evidence was played for the jury multiple times. Other residents testified about Margaret's pattern of abuse of power. Margaret's defense was essentially that she'd been trying to help the community, that I'd created a dangerous situation with the Wasps, and that the break-in was a justified emergency response. Her attorney tried to paint me as a vindictive neighbor who deliberately endangered her with the wasp nests. The prosecutor tore that apart. He pointed out that the wasps were on my private property, that Margaret had been trespassing when she encountered them, and that even if there had been a legitimate safety concern, the proper response would have been to contact authorities, not to break into my cabin with a sledgehammer weeks later. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts for all 3 defendants. Sentencing happened in February. Judge Hendricks was not lenient. Margaret got 3 years in prison with 2 years supervised release. Jerry got 2.5 years. Pat got 2 years. All 3 were ordered to pay restitution totaling $18,000 plus court costs. This was a coordinated, premeditated act of vandalism and intimidation, Judge Hendricks said. You abused positions of trust in your community, engaged in theft and harassment, and when called to account, you responded with criminal destruction. This court takes property crimes seriously, particularly when they're committed out of spite and revenge. Margaret's face crumbled as she was led away. I felt a complex mix of emotions watching her go. Part of me felt vindicated. Part of me felt sad that it had come to this. A tiny part of me felt guilty about the Wasps, though rationally I knew I'd done nothing illegal by having them on my property. The restitution money came through over the following months, garnished from their assets. Margaret had to sell her lake cabin to pay her share. Jerry and Pat sold assets as well. I put the money toward completely renovating my cabin, turning it into something even nicer than it had been. The legal saga finally ended in April. Margaret, Jerry, and Pat were in prison. My cabin was repaired and better than ever. The new HOA board was functional and drama-free, and I had one hell of a story to tell. The Wasps, ironically, became something of a legend in the lake community. People joked about it being the most creative response to HOA overreach they'd ever heard. A few neighbors even thanked me, saying the whole situation had finally brought attention to Margaret's abuses and led to meaningful reforms. I still kept bees as a hobby after that, but regular honeybees, not yellow jackets. I built proper hives on my property and actually got into honey production as a side project. The irony wasn't lost on me. Bill thought the whole thing was hilarious. "You fought fire with wasps," he said one evening that spring as we sat on my rebuilt deck, watching the sunset over the lake. "I've lived here 20 years, and that's the most Minnesota passive-aggressive thing I've ever witnessed." "I didn't mean for it to go that far," I said. "I just wanted her to stop stealing my wood." "Yeah, but she couldn't help herself. She had to escalate. That's the problem with people like Margaret. They can't stand losing, so they keep doubling down until they destroy themselves." He was right. If Margaret had just stopped after the first wasp encounter, or even after being removed from the board, none of the criminal stuff would have happened. But her ego couldn't handle it, so she kept pushing until she pushed herself right into prison. The following summer, I was back at the cabin every weekend, enjoying my sanctuary in peace. The lake was beautiful, the fishing was good, and the HOA meetings were boring in the best possible way. I rebuilt my firewood shed bigger and better than before, with proper locks and even better security cameras. I split 3 cords of oak and birch that summer, stacking them neatly, enjoying the meditative rhythm of the work. And nobody, not once, touched a single log without permission. I ran into Susan, the woman from the meeting who'd had her wood stolen, at the community beach one Saturday in July. She was there with her grandkids, and we got to talking. "You know, I felt bad about Margaret for a while, she said. Prison seemed harsh. Yeah, I struggled with that too. But then I thought about what she did, not just to you, but to all of us. The lying, the stealing, the intimidation. She thought her position made her untouchable. Power corrupts, even small power. Especially small power, I think. At least with big power, there's oversight. With HOA stuff, people think they can do whatever they want because who's going to stop them? We watched her grandkids playing in the shallow water, shrieking with joy. The Wasps were genius, though, Susan added. I mean, legally questionable maybe, but genius. They were on my property, I said, though I was smiling. Just doing wasp things. Right, just nature taking its course. August rolled around, and I was splitting a new delivery of wood when a car pulled into my driveway. I didn't recognize the vehicle, a blue Honda sedan, and tensed up for a moment before remembering that Margaret was locked up in Shakopee Women's Prison and couldn't bother me anymore. A woman in her 30s got out, professional-looking in business-casual attire. Lawrence Baker? That's me. I'm Jennifer Santos, reporter for Minnesota Monthly Magazine. I'm working on a story about HOA abuses and legal reforms. Your case came up in my research. Would you be willing to talk? I almost said no. The whole thing was behind me, and I didn't particularly want to relive it. But then I thought about other people dealing with similar situations. HOA boards run amok, petty tyrants with just enough power to make life miserable. Yeah, I'll talk. We spent 2 hours going through the whole story. Jennifer was thorough, asking questions I hadn't even considered, drawing out details about how the HOA system had enabled Margaret's behavior and what reforms might prevent similar situations. The article came out in October, titled "The HOA Horror Show: When Neighborhood Associations Go Rogue." My story was featured prominently, along with several other Minnesota cases of HOA abuse. The Wasp detail made it into the headline, "Homeowners' Creative Justice: When HOA Theft Met Nature's Revenge." The article got picked up nationally. Suddenly I was getting calls from other publications, even a couple of cable news shows. I did a few interviews, always emphasizing that the real issue wasn't the Wasps, it was the lack of accountability in HOA governance. The attention led to actual change. The Minnesota legislature took up HOA reform bills that session, introducing measures requiring better oversight, clearer limits on board authority, and easier processes for homeowners to challenge overreach. Several of the bills passed and were signed into law. I became something of an accidental activist, testifying before committees, speaking at homeowner association meetings, advocating for better governance structures. It was weird being the face of HOA reform, but also kind of satisfying. And through it all, the cabin remained my refuge. Whatever was happening in Minneapolis or St. Paul or Washington, I could drive north to Pine Ridge Lake, split some firewood, sit on my deck with a beer, and watch the sun set over the water. The new HOA board functioned smoothly. Meetings were well attended. Decisions were made transparently. Nobody tried to steal anybody's firewood. In November, I got a letter from Margaret. It had been forwarded from the prison mail system, 2 pages of handwritten text. She didn't apologize exactly, but she explained. The divorce had devastated her. She'd felt powerless and lost. The HOA presidency had given her a sense of control and purpose. When people challenged her authority, it felt like losing everything all over again, so she fought back harder each time. The break-in, she wrote, had been Jerry's idea, but she'd gone along with it because she was so angry, so desperate to punish me for humiliating her. She knew it was wrong even as she was doing it, but she couldn't stop herself. Now, sitting in prison with nothing but time to think, she saw how insane it all was, how she'd thrown away her freedom, her reputation, and her property over firewood and pride. She ended by saying she didn't expect forgiveness, but she wanted me to know she understood what she'd done and why it was wrong. I read the letter twice, then filed it away. I didn't respond. What would I say? There was nothing that would change what happened or undo the consequences, but I did feel a sense of closure. Margaret was a cautionary tale about what happens when you let bitterness and control issues run your life. I'd been angry, sure, but I'd channeled it into a creative, if risky, solution that ultimately exposed her behavior, rather than escalating into criminal activity. The Wasps had been my line. Petty, maybe even a bit cruel, but legal and on my property. Margaret had crossed into actual crimes because she couldn't accept losing. December brought the first real snow, covering the lake in white and making the cabins look like something from a postcard. I came up for one last weekend before Christmas, wanting to see the place in its winter beauty. Bill had a small gathering at his cabin, a handful of year-round residents plus a few weekenders like me who'd made the trek despite the weather. We drank hot cider, told stories, and watched the snow fall through the pines. To surviving the HOA wars, Bill toasted, raising his mug. To boring governance and peaceful property ownership, I added. Everyone drank to that. Later, walking back to my cabin through the snow, I passed my firewood shed. The wood was stacked neatly, covered by the overhanging roof, ready for whenever I needed it. No wasps this time. Just wood. I went inside, started a fire in the wood stove using logs I'd split myself, and settled into my chair with a book. The cabin was warm and quiet. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing everything in peaceful white. This was what I'd fought for. Not the money or the vindication or the media attention, just the simple right to own my property, use my resources, and be left alone. Margaret had spent months trying to take that from me through bureaucratic manipulation and eventually criminal acts. The Wasps had been my unconventional defense, a natural consequence that exposed her trespassing and theft. The legal system had done the rest. Spring would come eventually. The snow would melt, the lake would thaw, and the cycle would begin again. I'd be here, splitting wood, maintaining my cabin, enjoying my sanctuary. And if any future HOA board members got ideas about community resource sharing, well, there were always more wasps in Minnesota. Though hopefully, the reforms and the cautionary tale of Margaret Johnson would prevent anyone from being that stupid again. I fed another log into the stove and watched the flames dance. Outside, the wind picked up, sending snow swirling through the trees. Inside, I was warm and safe and utterly at peace. The HOA war was over. I'd won, not through escalation or revenge, but by defending my property in a creative way and then letting Margaret's own actions destroy her. Sometimes justice comes from the courts. Sometimes it comes from the natural consequences of people's choices. And sometimes, just sometimes, it comes from wasps. I raised my coffee mug in a silent toast to those aggressive little yellow jackets who'd started the chain of events that led to actual accountability. They were just doing what wasps do, defending their territory, just like I'd been doing all along. The fire crackled, the snow fell. The lake community slept peacefully under its winter blanket. And somewhere in Shakopee, Margaret Johnson had 2 more years to think about the difference between authority and power, between leadership and control, and between community service and theft. I hoped she learned the lessons. But even if she didn't, at least she wouldn't be stealing anybody's firewood for a while. I finished my coffee, banked the fire for the night, and headed to bed. Tomorrow I'd drive back to Minneapolis, back to my regular life, but I'd carry this place with me. The peace, the satisfaction, the hard-won victory over petty tyranny. And next summer, I'd be back, splitting more wood, stacking it in my shed, and enjoying every moment of my property rights. Without wasps, probably. But you never know. Nature has a way of providing exactly what you need, exactly when you need it, even if what you need is a few thousand angry yellow jackets. I fell asleep smiling, the wind howling outside, the cabin warm and secure around me. My sanctuary, my property, my firewood, mine. The end came quietly, not with drama, but with resolution. The legal battles were finished. The restitution was paid. The reforms were implemented. Margaret served her time and eventually got out, moving to a different state to start over. Jerry and Pat served their sentences too, both emerging chastened and considerably poorer. Last I heard, neither of them wanted anything to do with HOA governance ever again. The Pine Ridge Lake community thrived under competent, reasonable management. Property values actually increased after the turmoil, with the improved governance structure making it a more attractive place to own. As for me, I kept my cabin, kept splitting my wood, and kept enjoying my weekends at the lake. I eventually started dating someone I met through the HOA reform activism, a paralegal named Rachel who'd had her own HOA horror story in Duluth. We bonded over our shared trauma and our shared love of property rights. She thought the Wasp story was hilarious. Years passed. The cabin became more than just a weekend retreat. It became a symbol of what you can protect if you're creative, persistent, and willing to stand up to bullies, even bureaucratic ones. I never forgot the lessons, though. Power, even small power, needs oversight. Rules need to make sense and be applied fairly. And sometimes, the best defense against petty tyrants is not to fight them on their terms, but to find your own creative solutions. The Wasp logs had been my creative solution. Risky, yes. Potentially dangerous, sure, but ultimately legal and ultimately effective at exposing Margaret's theft and trespassing. Everything that came after, her arrest, her conviction, her imprisonment, those were consequences of her own choices to escalate, to break laws, to try to intimidate rather than accept accountability. I'd simply defended my property in an unconventional way, and in doing so, I'd accidentally sparked reforms that helped thousands of other Minnesota homeowners dealing with similar abuses. Not bad for a guy who just wanted to keep his firewood. The story became something people told at lake gatherings, a legend of sorts. Remember when Lawrence put wasps in his firewood to stop the HOA president from stealing it? The details got exaggerated over time, the number of wasps growing, the drama intensifying. But the core remained true. A man protecting his property from theft. A HOA president who couldn't handle being caught. And wasps, nature's perfect defenders, doing what wasps do best. It was a Minnesota story through and through. Passive-aggressive? Maybe. Effective? Absolutely. And as I sat on my deck one final evening that first spring after everything was resolved, watching the ice break up on the lake, listening to the loons call, I felt a deep satisfaction. My firewood was mine. My cabin was mine. My peace was restored. Margaret was learning her lessons behind bars. The community was healing, and I was exactly where I wanted to be. Sometimes the little victories matter most. Sometimes standing up to petty tyrants makes the biggest difference. And sometimes, just sometimes, wasps are exactly what you need. I raised my beer to the empty air, to the coming summer, to property rights and reasonable governance and creative solutions, and to wasps, those magnificent little defenders who'd help me prove a point without me having to break a single law. Here's to nature providing exactly what we need when we need it most, even if what we need is a few angry yellow jackets and the courage to use them. The lake reflected the sunset, orange and pink and gold. The trees budded with new growth. Spring was here, bringing renewal and fresh starts. My fresh start was already a year old, but it felt new every time I returned to this place, this sanctuary I'd fought to protect. And I'd keep protecting it, keep enjoying it, keep splitting firewood and stacking it in my shed. Without fear, without harassment, without theft. Just peace, property rights, and the occasional memory of the time I fought an HOA president with wasps and won. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.